Hey, and welcome back to your number one source for cozy gaming and design content. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the state of gaming on Mac and whether or not it's worth a shot. So, let's get into it. Before we talk about how well Mac currently runs games, we should talk about why this is even a video worth making in the first place. After all, macOS is just another operating system, just like Windows, right? Why wouldn't it play games just fine? Well, for those of you who didn't hear anything wrong with that statement, I have a bit of explaining to do. Now, I'm no developer, but I'll try to explain the differences as well as I can as someone who's used all three rather extensively at this point. Currently today, there are three major operating systems you can choose from for your personal computer: Windows, macOS, and various Linux distributions. From the very top level, you wouldn't be wrong in saying they're all the same, because yes, they are all OSs, or operating systems. And as far as basic functionality goes, yeah, they all do generally the same fundamental things, like letting the user interface with the computer. After all, unless you're fluent in binary, and even then I suspect, you won't get very far with a computer without some sort of translation. Computers use binary logic. That's to say they think in ones and zeros, specifically ons and offs, because the actual way that they think is by turning circuits on and off. So we need a way to translate between something we humans can understand and those ones and zeros. To start, all three of these OSs are what's called GUI interfaces. GUI stands for Graphical User Interface. These differ from command line interfaces, where you need to type in commands directly in order for your computer to do anything. Both GUI and command line are doing the same thing functionally though, translating something we can understand into something the computer can understand. The only difference is that in a GUI, those same commands are hidden behind things like buttons and menus, so you, the user, don't have to remember long strings of commands and type them in perfectly every time. However, the implementation and actual translation varies greatly between different operating systems. You can think of it kind of like how localizations of different books or games can have vastly different meanings and interpretations gathered from them depending on who's translating them. I'm not going to get into the specifics and the particularities because I genuinely have no idea where I would even start to figure out any of that, and I really didn't exactly feel like getting a computer science degree just to make this video. Suffice it to say though, just because an OS looks and functions similarly to another doesn't mean it can do all the same things. And it doesn't mean that a program written for one operating system can just run seamlessly on any other. And this is especially true with the vastly more popular GUI-based OSs. Something as simple as a volume slider will have different code behind it depending on what the OS is that you're running. The graphical elements can be identical, but the code could be vastly different. Everything we do on computers had to be programmed to work, and all that back-end stuff we never see plays a huge role in that. And that back-end stuff is what makes these OSs different. Now is where we get into the games. Most games on the market are either made for Windows and ported to other things like consoles, Mac or Linux, or they're made for consoles and ported the other way around, with priority usually going to Windows. Porting is essentially converting the code of a game to work on something it wasn't originally intended for. Oftentimes, this requires a lot of recoding and just generally remaking the game so that it can actually work. Now, there are certain games that are made specifically for Mac or Linux, but the vast majority of games are made to run on either Windows or one of the other consoles natively. Because of this, those other two operating systems, macOS and Linux, historically have had a lot of problems playing these games, and it was generally accepted that if you wanted to play a game on your PC, you should just get a Windows PC. However, relatively recently, That has been changing. Both Linux and macOS have started to implement something called a compatibility layer. This is essentially code that translates between the OS and what the game is expecting. It's kind of like on-the-fly porting. However, this generally comes with a pretty big hit to performance unless done by an extremely talented team or a team who was actually given the budget and time to do their best work. So still, the sentiment is that if you want to play a game, you should do it on Windows. And to make it even worse, in the past, Apple has made it very difficult for developers to make any headway on getting their games to work on Mac. Historically, Apple seemed to just ignore games as a possibility on macOS. With the release of Apple's M-series chips, they suddenly started including gaming in their keynotes and marketing. This was a huge change, and while it still wasn't particularly great from a performance perspective, and there still weren't a ton of games slated for release on macOS, it marked a major change in Apple's attitude towards people wanting to game on their operating system. Now, to be clear, they haven't become a game company or anything like that. They still very much are that overly controlling, elitist company they've always been. But now, at least, they try to support games. And that is what I wanted to test with this video. I recently got this base model M3 MacBook Air. Yes, I know it's wildly underspec'd for most things. However, my choice was based around wanting to use this specifically for writing these scripts on the go and web browsing. And because I use Google Docs for that, I really didn't mind the cut down memory, spec, or anemic storage. And frankly, my experience with Windows laptops has been utterly atrocious, with everything from weird bugs to piss poor battery performance and phantom drain. So this is a step up in stability that, for what I care about using a laptop for, is greatly appreciated. I also wanted to give macOS a shot again. When I was younger, we had a family iMac, which me and my brothers used for just about everything computing, even a few underpowered games. But I hadn't used a Mac as a daily workhorse since probably about middle school. So I figured I'd give it a shot and see what they had to offer. And I was particularly interested in seeing just how much gaming I could get with this incredibly low-spec laptop. Now, obviously, this isn't going to run anything like Cyberpunk or Dragon's Dogma 2, so I'll never be getting rid of my Windows PC, particularly because I use it for video editing, and there is no way that this thing could handle DaVinci well enough for what I use it for. But just because it won't handle the most highly demanding games and programs, that doesn't mean it can't do well in those other categories. So I wanted to see how the experience would be playing retro emulation and indie games. So I grabbed Steam and downloaded a couple of my favorites that reported they should be able to run on macOS. And I gave them a shot. Overall, I found the experience fairly good, actually. Hey, mid-edit Nick here. I realized I got a bit carried away with things other than what my actual experience gaming on Mac was like, so let's talk a bit about that. Like I said, my overall experience has actually been pretty good. For the most part, games that I wanted to play from Steam worked just fine. However, I did run into a few issues which, while not major for someone used to dealing with Windows BS, could easily be a big issue for someone who's all in on the Apple ethos. The big issue I had was controller support. In Dave the Diver, my controller just straight up wouldn't be recognized. Now, I do think this might be a bug with the game and not necessarily with macOS, because I've had the same issue when trying to use a wireless controller on Windows. However, I was able to eventually get that to work, but I wasn't on Mac, so maybe there's some difference in the code there. Either way, it's very much a game that you're going to want to play with a controller, or at least I prefer to play with a controller, so that being a barrier is a bit of a bummer. And I had similar issues with Blasphemous and briefly with Tunic. The other issue I had was with Dave the Diver not launching at all. Apparently, they did get that fixed because it launches just fine now, but again, those are the kinds of things that are lacking about the Mac gaming experience at the moment. There are a lot of features in these games that assume Windows and particular implementations, and when those aren't there, those features break, and that is a bit of a bummer. And I found the experience to be kind of stuttery at times in the frame rate department, specifically on games like Dave the Diver and Tunic, which are a little bit more visually complex. I also noticed some visual glitches in Eastward, and that's probably just a implementation issue. However, I do think that the fact that these games launched at all, and on the whole were totally playable, is awesome, and a huge improvement over where macOS gaming used to be in the Intel days. And the fact that these are modern titles gives me hope that Mac gamers will have something to look forward to, especially with the ongoing antitrust trials against Apple right now. Currently, at time of writing, Apple is being sued by the DOJ here in the US. I won't get into the particulars, but if the DOJ comes out ahead on this, and even if they don't, it's very possible that we'll see Apple take down some of their barriers to entry, and hopefully that'll make game compatibility more feasible for devs to implement in macOS. Hopefully this lawsuit will make Apple and the rest of the tech giants here in the Bay Area recognize that they should really rein in their anti-consumer practices, and hopefully they'll find it to be more beneficial to actually make a good product rather than to try to con their users into only having one option. But now, back to past me. I was pleasantly surprised at just how well most of the games I tried to play performed. Now, to be clear, this is far from an exhaustive list of titles. I'm no LTT Labs, so I can't tell you the ins and outs of what's going on here. But what I can tell you, and what I'm aiming to show with this video, is that gaming on Mac is dangerously close to viable. And it's the same situation for Linux right now. Gaming on Linux is extremely close to being feasible for a lot of people. However, the across-the-board support for games just isn't quite there yet. I think once you're able to only worry about whether or not the hardware will run a game well, is when Windows will have real competition in this space. And I think that point is closer than it's ever really been. For years, the mere mention of gaming on Mac was laughable, but now we're seeing that visually complex and computationally expensive games can and are being run on macOS. Sure, those titles are limited now, but when has that ever been a good indicator of whether or not a technology will work? And I know a lot of you, if you've made it to this point in this video, are probably rolling your eyes and saying, Mac gamers aren't real gamers, dude. If you want to play a game, just get a cheap Windows PC and upgrade it. That'll be a much better value. And you're right, the value to you and I is certainly there, and I was fully on board that train for a long time. But as I get older, and as the average age of gamers rises, I think we are seeing a more and more reasonable and open-minded sentiment towards other gamers. There is a reason that it's easier to catch flies with honey than vinegar is a saying. If what we want is for there to be more gamers in the world and for more people to see the merits and value of games, we need to make it more approachable. And that doesn't just mean combating toxicity in the hobby when we see it, but it also means meeting people where they're at. And a lot of people have a lot of very valid reasons to choose Apple. One of the most refreshing things I found while using this laptop was using this laptop. I don't need to faff about with game settings or system controls to get things working optimally. To be clear, this isn't justification for locking those settings down or not allowing you to do that and do what you want with your hardware. But for the games it works well in, they run well. And the addition of game mode, which was a massive step forward for Apple, is a huge part of that. If Apple continues down this road of supporting their customers who do want to dip their toes into the world of gaming, I think there's a very positive future ahead. Not just for Apple's bottom line, but for us gamers as well. More people in the hobby is a good thing, and more variety in those people is incredibly important. So don't just write it off if someone asks about gaming on a Mac. We all start somewhere, and even if macOS never does reach that full saturation point, at the very least, they can help bring new people into our circles, and new voices into the gaming conversation. But that's it for today's video. What do you think of gaming on Mac? Do you think I'm wrong about this whole thing? Either way, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a great day. And, as always, happy gaming.